Hi, this is James Sakalis, developer of Spiral Somatics and teacher of Handed NLP, which is a course for practitioners, master practitioners and trainers of NLP who would like to significantly enhance their capacity both to adapt and scale almost any NLP application pattern so that you can apply it easily and effectively in 1,000 different contexts and for 1,000 different purposes, rather than just in the context and for the purpose with which it was originally presented to you. And also for people who would like to really develop their ability to improvise with both ease and expertise, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, no matter what kind of unusual or inconvenient variables are part of the equation, so that it doesn't make any difference. So that if you want to, for example, facilitate a phobia cure and you're with someone who can't make pictures, they have aphantasia, you know that that doesn't matter. You know that that might be the most common way in which people run the phobia cure, but you also know that there's a bunch of other ways that you could do it as well. And I don't mean different patterns, I mean other ways of facilitating that particular pattern. And you also know that there's a bunch of different ways of, you don't need to introduce the metaphor of parts or unconscious minds or altered states in order to do a 6-step reframe. There's 1,000 ways of doing 1,000 different things. You don't need to elicit submodalities to do the classic belief change pattern. You can do any of these things in 1,000 different ways and any combination of things in 1,000 different ways, formally or conversationally in a nice controlled environment or in a raucous bar or restaurant. And none of those things are any impediments to you facilitating any kind of process that you want to facilitate. And if you're watching this right now, by the way, if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, well, that's just normal, I can already do all of that stuff, right? That's none of those things are an issue. I know that you don't need to have people visualize to do the phobia cure. You can do it in 1,000 different ways. I know that you don't need people to make pictures to do swishes. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do swishes. You can do, all sorts of things like this. There's no kind of issue with me scaling patterns and applying them in an organizational context or applying them for totally different purposes, for lateral purposes based on their structure. If you're having that experience while you're watching this, then please be aware of a couple of things. First of all, be aware that there's a pretty good chance that you're not the intended audience for this video or for the subsequent course, because there's a pretty good chance that when you learned NLP, at some points along the way, you learned NLP in a pattern-centric approach to learning, as opposed to what's far more common these days, a more procedural kind of approach to learning or a scripted approach to learning NLP, which no doubt you'll have noticed. The vast majority of people who have learned NLP today have learned the various NLP application patterns, the various processes, as kind of either a set of step-by-step techniques or in some cases as scripted techniques. And secondly, if you're watching this and again, this is all stuff that's like, old news to you, be aware also that your trainer is a gem among NLP trainers in the world today. So send him a box of chocolates and please give them my regards. You have been very fortunate. But again, most people don't learn that way. I was very fortunate in that my initial training, apart from the fact that yes, I've been doing this stuff for 20 years and yes, I've learned from 30 plus different people from lots of different schools and styles of NLP, which I recommend, by the way, and I recommend in particular if you're planning to be, or if you are a trainer of NLP, I recommend learning from lots of different people, from lots of different schools of NLP, different lineages, let's say, of NLP. Because when you do that, you realize really quickly that there's quite a lot of diversity out there, and the way that you learned to do it is not the way it's done. It's one way that it's done, and there are lots of other very different ways that this stuff is done. So I recommend that very highly. But as I was saying, apart from the fact that, yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, I've trained with a lot of people, I was very fortunate in that my thinking about and my approach to both the practice and the teaching of NLP was very heavily informed both directly by my mentor, a gentleman called Roger Diener, and also indirectly via his mentor, a gentleman called Marvin Oka. And I was very fortunate because, like Roger, when I did my initial training with Roger, he didn't teach the way that most people teach, right? He didn't do the whole scripts thing, for example. But not only that, when Roger came to NLP, he didn't come from a background of coaching or facilitation or hypnosis or therapy or anything like that. That just wasn't his background. His background initially was in science. He was a chemist by training, and then ended up working for a multinational corporation, progressing up through the ranks, getting transferred to Australia, where he ended up in the position of divisional managing director for this multinational corporation. So the vast majority of his career was spent running stuff, basically, it's mediating and negotiating and managing and motivating and all of that kind of stuff, all of that high-level corporate stuff. And he was never initially attracted to NLP. What happened was he had this distinguished corporate career, and then he burned out at a certain period of time after a while, and so he left the company that he was with, bummed around for a little while, and then went into business for himself as a negotiator for hire. And one of the jobs that he got, one of the gigs that he got as a negotiator for hire, was negotiating a contract between some people in Australia and a renowned expert in neuro-linguistic programming and accelerated learning from the United States called Marvin Oka, the aforementioned Marvin Oka. Because Marvin was coming to Australia and he was coming to run a program for young people, for teens and preteens, in which he would be teaching them some accelerated learning strategies, from some emotional management strategies, some communication skills, all of that kind of stuff. And so it was that Roger was negotiating with Marvin, but Roger also at the time happened to have a stepdaughter who was about the right kind of age to do this particular program. And he thought, well, this seems like a pretty cool thing, a pretty good opportunity. And so he sent his daughter Elise to do this program. And so Elise, young woman, goes and learns a bunch of this NLP stuff at this program, and comes back, and the result of that is that she came back and was pretty much, she had her parents wrapped around her little finger, was getting anything that she wanted, and pretty much ran the household. And so Roger and his partner Carolyn went, no, that's not cool. You're like, screw that, we needs to learn this stuff, right? She's just getting away with murder here. And so they both learned NLP. And then later when Roger began his apprenticeship with Marvin, because he did several years of apprenticeship with Marvin, just as I did with Roger, he was coming from a point where he didn't have a background in facilitation or coaching or any of that kind of stuff. His background was in high-end corporate. And so when he started running his NLP practitioner programs, the people that came on his courses were all CEOs and managing directors and general managers, national sales and marketing managers, HR directors, this kind of thing, and the occasional smattering of people like me who were kind of the odd ones out, But a consequence of that is that when I learned NLP, I didn't learn, when we started learning these NLP techniques, these patterns, these processes, I never learned these processes as, here is this thing that you use to facilitate some kind of personal change in a human being with whom you are working one-on-one in some kind of coaching or therapeutic context. That's not what I learned. What I learned was, here's a pattern that you can use to effectively negotiate workplace agreements. Here's a pattern that you can use to mediate between mutually adversarial experts, both of whom you need on a particular project. Here's so these are the things that I learned. I learned that these patterns are applicable to lots of different kinds of circumstances, and incidentally also for the purposes of making certain personal changes in someone one-on-one if you happen to be working and doing that kind of thing. So I never got this idea in my brain that any of these application patterns were specifically and solely for facilitating some kind of personal change with someone as a coach or as a change worker or a therapist or anything like that. I got that these things are incredibly versatile patterns which, due to their structure, you can apply for lots of purposes in lots of different situations. That was just my starting point, So I was very fortunate to have Roger as a teacher in that particular regard. But I was also fortunate because when I began my apprenticeship, I ended up becoming very heavily informed by my own teacher's mentor in terms of the way that he approached learning, because he was an expert in accelerated learning. He's someone who thought very deeply and explored very widely the subject of learning and developed a number of different models of learning. And so I came very early to think about processes and patterns and learning itself and the nature of learning itself in very different ways from the ways in which most NLP trainers think about those things and approach those things. And so a classic example of this, which is directly related to where we're going here, is that when it comes to learning how-to stuff, right? Because there's all sorts of things that you can learn. You can learn content, you can learn information, you can learn things about yourself, you can engage in self-reflective learning, self-discovery, this kind of thing. But one of the other things that you can learn is how to do stuff, right? And when it comes to learning how to do stuff, there's a few different ways that traditionally plays out. So there are some approaches to how-to learning that involve rote learning. There are some approaches which involve procedural learning, and there are some approaches which involve pattern-centric learning or pattern-based learning, also known as process-based learning. But because a lot of people kind of confuse the terms process and procedure, I have chosen to focus instead on the word pattern, pattern-centric learning. And in terms of people learning NLP and people teaching NLP, all of this stuff plays out. So you would know, for example, if your NLP training was a rote learning approach to NLP training, if you got scripts, for example, right? So if the way in which you learned a variety of NLP processes, a variety of NLP patterns, let's say, was via scripts, you got handouts that have scripts on them and you got to read these things and memorize these things, then you engaged in rote learning. Your teacher, your trainer, leans towards rote learning as a way of teaching some of this how-to stuff for any one of a number of different reasons. The primary feature of rote learning is memorization. It's all just about memorize this, burn this into your mind. It's not about understanding things. It's not about extrapolating things from first principles. It's not about anything like that. It's purely just memorize this. This is how it's done. And it has a couple of benefits. Rote learning as an approach to learn how-to stuff has a couple of benefits. For a learner, one benefit that it has is that if you're in a classroom, if you've got a whole bunch of other people who are doing an exercise, then there's a high degree of consistency with rote learning, the highest possible degree, because everybody's doing it word for word, right? And so what that means is that if you're a learner in a classroom and you're doing an exercise, you know whether you're doing it right or not, because you're either doing it exactly the same as everybody else or you're not. And if you are, then you're doing it right, and if you're not, then you're not, because everything has to be word for word. And so it's very clear in terms of feedback from the learner's perspective in a classroom environment, feedback from the rest of the group, as it were. It also has a benefit for a trainer in that if you approach things from a rote learning perspective, it's quite quick. It doesn't take very long. You hand someone a piece of paper and say, read this, right? It's a very, very quick, very efficient way of approaching things. But it doesn't tend to involve a lot of understanding of how things work. It tends to be relatively superficial, but it's very useful for beginners in terms of that kind of feedback from the people around them. But there's also procedural learning, and a lot of NLP training is also done approached in a procedural learning fashion, and you would know that you had learned NLP in a procedural learning fashion if the way that you learned a lot of these NLP application patterns, a lot of these techniques, let's say, was via a set of step-by-step procedures. Step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this, step 4, do this, step 5, do this, etc. Right? Relatively small chunk, relatively linear and sequential. And procedural learning, again, has a couple of advantages. It's almost but not quite as consistent in terms of its practice as a rote learning approach. I mean, everything's not scripted, so there's going to be some variation in there. But by and large, from a learner's perspective, if there's a whole bunch of people doing an exercise and you're following a particular step-by-step procedure, you're going to get some fairly clear feedback, not as clear as the scripted-based stuff, but fairly clear feedback about, am I going through the exact same set of steps as everybody else? So that can be quite useful for a learner. And for a trainer, it's also relatively efficient. It's not as fast as just giving people a script, but it's relatively efficient. It does require a little bit more effort on the part of a trainer, though, because with procedural-based learning, because it's not scripted, there's no script, step 1, step 2, step 3, there's no script for step 3. And so in order for people to know what they're doing at step 3, the trainer typically has to offer, and any other step, of course, the trainer typically has to offer some kind of demonstration, right? So there'll be a demonstration of here's how to do this particular procedure, right? So step 1, step 2, step 3, and here's how you would do it. So here's how you would do the first step, here's how you might do the second step, here's how you would do the third step, so that people have some kind of reference for how to do each of the individual steps. So that takes a little bit more time and effort on the part of the trainer, but it's still relatively efficient, right? You do a demonstration, you write up a set of instructions, or you give people a handout, they do the exercise, you debrief the exercise, you move on. It involves a little bit more flexibility than rote learning, than scripted based learning, because you're free, as long as you're following this particular set of steps, then you can use your own words a little bit, right? You've got a little bit of flexibility in terms of how you do things. So this particular step-by-step procedure can be expressed in 1,000 different ways, but all of those ways, regardless of the individual words being used, all of those ways are going to be following very strictly this linear, sequential, small chunk sequence of steps. Pattern-centric learning, or pattern-based learning, is a different kettle of fish. The difference between a procedure and a pattern is that a pattern is a sequence of high-level process components. It's much more broad than a step-by-step procedure. It's more like, if you imagine, for example, right, scripted-based learning, you've got like a page full of texts, read out all of this stuff, right? Procedural-based learning, what you've got is step 1, do this, step 2, do this, a series of instructions, right? With pattern-centric or pattern-based learning, it's more like a flow chart, right? So first thing, do this component, next do this component, next do this component. It's a lot more, it's a bit more global chunk, let's say, than procedural-based stuff. It involves a lot more flexibility, because in the same way that a step-by-step procedure, a very linear, rigid step-by-step procedure, can nonetheless be expressed in 1,000 different ways in terms of words choice and all of that kind of stuff. A pattern can be expressed in 1,000 different forms in terms of sequences of actions on the part of someone running that particular pattern, right? So if you think of a step-by-step procedure as a sequence of actions that someone does, a pattern, someone facilitating a pattern, can do that via any number of different sequences of actions that nonetheless still conform to that same pattern, that same sequence of high-level process components. And so it involves a lot more flexibility, which of course, there's always a trade-off between flexibility and consistency, or flexibility and that ease of feedback as a learner, let's say. And so what that means is that for a learner to be able to operate at this particular level, what's required is they need to really know the pattern in order to be able to have ways of expressing that pattern in 1,000 different ways. And what that means for the trainer is that the trainer needs to create an environment in which there are opportunities to discover that pattern via presenting a range of different and highly varied sequences of actions, which nonetheless all conform to the same global pattern, so that people can filter out the difference between those things, so that the sameness emerges, and so that they recognize here is the pattern, here is the sequence that connects all of these different things. And so that takes a little bit of time and a little bit of energy on the part of the trainer. It also means that in order to really get this pattern and to get and to master this pattern, so that you can facilitate that pattern through a number of different sequences of actions, a number of different kind of forms, let's say, then it requires time to be able to do that, to practice a single pattern via a range of different forms. And so there's a little bit more required of a trainer, and a little bit more time required, which kind of gets into another video where I talk about how we got here to this particular point. But for the purposes of flexibility and adaptability and being able to improvise and scale things, pattern-centric learning is where it's at. And so in terms of empty-handed NLP, this is where we're going to be. This is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be exploring the application patterns with which you're already familiar, because once again, this is for NLP practitioners, master practitioners, and trainers. This is not an introduction to NLP. I'm not going to be teaching basic stuff. I really want to make that clear. This is not the time and place for that kind of thing. I'm going to be assuming that you already know how to build rapport, how to elicit states and calibrate and anchor, and I'm not going to be teaching Milton model or meta model or strategies or any of that kind of stuff. I'm going to be assuming that you already have these skills, and I'm also going to be assuming that you already have a whole bunch of application patterns, of processes, of techniques, let's say, that you've learned, that we're going to be exploring through the filter of pattern-centric learning, so that you have far more flexibility with these things. And in terms of flexibility, by the way, there are other videos that I've done. So there's, on this particular theme, there's a video about improvisation and NLP if you're interested in exploring something about that. There's also a video explaining the story behind the name Empty-Handed NLP, because there is a story. And there's also a video that explores a little bit how we got here, how we got to a point where a field that celebrates flexibility has developed to the point where the vast majority today of NLP trainers who teach NLP in such a procedural fashion. But this is where we're going to be going in terms of empty-handed NLP. So if this is something that is of interest to you, if this is something that resonates with you, if you're curious about this, then by all means get in touch and let's rock and roll with this, because I look forward to helping you develop more of your own capacity to be able to adapt and scale and improvise so that you can do NLP empty-handed.